Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be doing a general introduction to the notion of transference, which was a subscriber's request and I'm happy to oblige. So basically, we're not going to go into all the intricacies of transference as there are many of them. And the intricacies I will be talking about at the tail end of the video. My aim through this video is to give you a relatively short-ish understanding of what is transference and what it isn't. So very fundamentally, transference is one of the main ideas of psychoanalysis. It's one that was there from the get-go and has evolved throughout the development of the profession and of the field. So at the very fundamental core, transference are the feelings of attachment a patient is going to have for their therapist. So in those feelings of attachment there's going to be, of course, emotions, but there's also going to be projections. Transference can be both positive and negative, meaning that the patient can see good sins in the therapist and bad sins. So what's going to be very important is to understand that at the very start of psychoanalysis, transference was kind of seen by Freud as an obstacle, like something that was there but prevented the patient from really developing insights, that blockage was there because they were seeing the therapist as who they were not. So for Freud it was an obstacle. It's only later on that he found it useful, and at the tail end of his career, he found that it was a necessity to use it and to work with it. So why is that? How can we explain this evolution? Well, the beginning is quite simple. It's because you realize that when people come and see you, regardless of what they think of you, it's not accurate to who the therapist is, be it through the positive lens or the negative lens, be it through admiration, love, twinship, or through fear, withdrawal, anxiety, persecution, and so on and so forth. So the therapist is never really seen for who they are. And in psychoanalysis, at least for a very long time, the best course of action was seen as trying to be as neutral as possible in order for the patient to be able to project at maximum onto the therapist. Because what psychoanalysts postulate is that through this projection, what is really happening is that the patient is reenacting and re-experiencing all the love, hope, fear, disappointment of the primary relationship with the first caregivers. So very fundamentally, all of what was there with the primary caregivers is going to be there at the same level of intensity with the therapist. And whatever happened or didn't happen with them is also going to be present. So this idea is quite fundamental because transference unconsciously, because the patient is not thinking like that, right? It's not thinking, oh, my therapist is just like my dad, or the therapist is soft and gentle like my mom. It's rarely like that, but on an unconscious level, these very archaic patterns are coming back, and they're coming back at a very important force. Because they have someone that's completely dedicated to them for 1 hour, this is a lot of time for them to be able to integrate the relationship and be able to basically start to create a connection. Also, the therapist is attentive to the patient, perhaps more so than most other people, because you might say, yes, but the partners also, and that's even for partners of therapists, right, or therapists themselves, when you're in a love relationship, you also are there for your needs, but as a therapist, you don't put your needs first and foremost, you put the needs of the patient first. Therefore, you're completely dedicated to their betterment on a psychological level. So very fundamentally, that echoes back to a time where the mother was also completely there for the baby. Like, for example, what Winnicott called the maternal primary preoccupation, right? So basically it's the same kind of force that's coming back again in the relationship, but it comes back with all of the emotions, and that's what's very important. So the idea that psychoanalysis had at the beginning was that one had to be completely transparent. The therapists themselves, people, were not to be there. We had to remain a surface projection. You project whatever you want to project, but you project it, and we don't answer, we don't talk, we don't speak, and so on and so forth, because we don't want to interfere with that projection element of transference. But in the last decades, it has become clear that you might also need to be there as a person, as a human, because as we also know, babies do need more than just projecting onto the adult. They need the adult to really be there, to really talk, to really engage with them. Not being there is also complicated for the baby. Therefore, it's also important for the therapist to be able to be there for the patient and be there as a person, as a real human being. That doesn't mean that you have to disclose everything, right? Or it's a friendship where it's basically it's 50-50. No, none of that. But it's just that sometimes sometimes they need to ask certain questions, and the therapist may or may not answer, but they have to explain and they have to be there and try and understand why. And sometimes answering the questions can be therapeutic because you're not hindering the transference, you're just helping the patient build trust in the relationship, and also it doesn't prevent projection, because whatever the patient wants to project onto you, they're gonna do so. There's no stopping it, be it good sins or bad sins, right? And I would even say trying to stop it is a hindrance. The patient is going to project what they want to project. Anyway, coming back to this notion of transference. The transference is very important because this is the boat that's being built. It's going to be able to navigate through the waters of the unconscious, the ocean of the unconscious. How so? Well, basically, when the therapist is going to give interpretations, what's going to hold the therapeutic relationship together is the notion of transference, the positive and negative, the attachments, because this is going to be what can help the patient digest and tolerate what is being said. Because when you think about it really deep down, giving interpretations on the psyche of someone else is an incredibly violent action when you really push the logic to the very end, to the very core, because what you're saying implicitly, even though you're not saying you're right or it's completely perfect, but you are giving an idea of what the other person is feeling, experiencing, living, or has lived, has experienced. So therefore, it's quite like a massive bomb, right, that you're giving the patient. And it's through transference, through the fact that they have an attachment, that they can like process it. Like, yes, well, it's hard, but perhaps that person which I estimate and that I have sympathy for is right. Perhaps there is something to it. So that's what helps the patient cope with the massivity of certain interpretations, which aren't always easy. Because this I think very wrong idea that we have that interpretations are easy on the mind of the patient. They're not. They're kind of very complicated because there are moments where the patient has to look within and look both to the good and to the bad elements of their personality. Therefore, it's very hard. And it's also very hard because it can be interpretations on traumatic events. Therefore, what's going to help it is that both, that very fundamental bond and strong connection that the patient has towards the therapist. That connection is going to help them go beyond that. So what you have to understand also is that there's a myriad of ways of doing transference. Not every patient does it in the same way. Some patients, for example, might shift very rapidly between positive and negative transference. Positive when they feel happy that the therapist is nice, etc. Therapist is kind if ever they, for example, I don't know, give them an extra session because they asked for it, and so on and so forth. And they might feel hurt, they might feel that the therapist is doesn't care, doesn't listen to them, doesn't try and create a connection with them. If, for example, there's a limit that has been set, or that you're disagreeing with certain of their demands. So some people are like that, shifting rapidly from one to the other. Some of us have a very continuous form of transference, be it slightly negative or slightly positive, but neither too extreme. Some of us also cannot handle the massivity of transference, and they are very afraid of being that connected to another human. So they might withdraw within another world during the sessions, not talking about themselves. They might intellectualize. They might put a barrier between them and the therapist. Some others might go and see another professional in another field. Like, for example, let's say they see a psychologist, but then they have a physiotherapist and they talk with a physiotherapist rather than with the psychologist, and so on and so forth. So everyone does it very, very differently. But the idea is that something is at play, something is being rekindled. I should also, and this make this more explicit, that the psychotherapeutic alliance isn't exactly transference. They're very close, right? I'm not saying that they don't cross at some point, but they're not exactly the same, because in the psychotherapeutic alliance, there's this idea that both patient and therapist are going to work together and to a certain goal, right? In transference, it's more one-sided. It's more the feelings that the patient has towards the therapist that is really going to be the key to the therapy, both in the contents, because what they project onto the professional is what is also needs to be worked on, or perhaps needs to be reinforced, but it's much more one-sided. So you might be saying, yes, so the other side is countertransference. Yes, so I'm not going to be talking too much about it, but yes, that's the other side of it, and that's what also strengthens the boat. But that is another discussion for another day. That yes, there are feelings of the therapist towards the patient. So transference is important, because I'm going back to this, is important because it allows the patient to relive something on an unconscious level, something that is quite important, quite immeasurable, that's going to be able to help them navigate the interpretations. At some point in the therapy also, and this is very important, there should be interpretations on transference, i.e. the therapist should try and talk with the patient of what they're feeling for them. So that interpretation towards a transference or about the transference has the aim of basically shifting the ideal therapist, right, to back to a normal human being. To not let this idea of this projection that has been very useful, yes, for the therapy, but has perhaps needs to be worked on also at some point to be able to shrink. In a way, both individuals come back to the same level of just being two people, rather than a professional and a patient. And this is important because fundamentally the patient, and this is what I think, needs to liquider in French, like diminish, right? The levels of attachments that they have, because they're often very high. Like, not everyone, but often they're very high, and having that highness is very important in order to help and in order for the patient to do what's best for them and to be able to relive, re-experience and reshape their experiences. But it should not stay that way, because it's far too much. And if the therapist is idealized forever, then it creates another form of basic alienation that is no longer towards the ideal parents, but towards the ideal therapist, and that's not good either. Like, that's why it's so important sometimes for the patient to be able to shift from positive to negative. Like, yes, a bit of disappointment has to be there, because it allows the patient to be in touch with their aggressive side. And that aggression is also very important, as I've said it many times in our videos, that aggression helps us to also be able to defend ourselves. And the issue with having only positive transference all the time is that the therapist becomes in a way, the protector of the patient, but the patient has to be their own protector, basically their own parent, if I may say so. And that's the whole point of psychotherapy. It's to bring them to a point where they can basically connect with others, live experiences, no longer be prisoners of their past. But it's not by replacing it by a new prison, right? It's about trying to put everything on an equal ground footing. And I'm not saying it's easy or that it's always doable. Sometimes it's better to just have a positive, completely positive image of someone, an idealized vision of someone, than be in complete despair, right? So it's very nuanced, and I'm not saying everyone has to be like that. Quite the opposite. People are very different, and they have different needs, different hopes, different objectives, and all that is very respectable. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's true that I do think that some, liquidation of transference is important, if it's possible, for the patient. So in order for them to, in a way, ascend to adulthood, because what you're doing when you're liquidating transference is saying, yeah, well, you're basically like the professional of your own self. There's nothing more I can bring to the table. So therefore we part almost not as professional as patients, but as true people on the same level. And I think there's some form of joy in that. And it's also, at least in my mind, this is how I conceive it. It's also like graduation, right? As the teacher, you say, yeah, nothing more I can teach you. That doesn't mean it's always the case, but sometimes, right? So, very fundamentally, transference is an essential and important part of psychotherapy. It basically underpins everything else that's going to come afterwards. It helps the patient survive the therapy, survive the more, complicated interpretations, and it helps the patient explore who they are through the connection. And we no longer, as therapists, need to be just pure white screens. We can be a bit of ourselves when needed, when that true connection is needed. Because it's not going to prevent transference, quite the opposite. It will help the patient to transfer, because we are a real person. And that realness is also what the patient is looking for. So by being real, it helps the patient connect. And it doesn't prevent projection, because if the patient wants to see something in you, they will. That's not that's not something that's gonna stop them at all. And you know this if you've had, for example, people in your environment that you dislike or have accused you of something that you haven't done. There might not be any way of convincing them otherwise, right? So it's a bit the same. If someone has decided on something, they've decided. Anyway, parentheses closed, right? Transference is a very important tool. And of course, a therapist can feel at unease with the transference of a patient. But that should not be considered as a judgment on them, but just how it is. Also, and very importantly, this transference is something that can be talked about and can be interrogated by the therapist. It's not some taboo, right? And that, I think, has to be open in the conversation with the patient in order to have a healthy dialogue about this. And that's pretty much it for it. So if you want to leave a question, feel free to do so in the comments. If you feel that you have something to add, also please share it. And I'll see you next time. Bye.